I'm Mike Quackenbush. This is Till We Make It, and a topic that I have written about in my book, 7 Keys to Becoming a Better Performer, and I've spoken about on Kayfabe 2.0, my podcast which preceded this series, and that I probably get asked to teach more than almost any other single topic about the performance of professional wrestling, is the way in which we must set up an obstacle for the third act of our performances so that the protagonist has something to overcome. How can we do that throughout the first 2 acts of our storytelling to make sure we add fuel to the fire of our false finishes? We're going to talk about overcoming the obstacle today on Till We Make It. A pro wrestling match assembled using traditional 3-act structure places the onus of the groundwork on the first 2 acts, the shine and the heat. All the groundwork needs to be laid there to make sure the third act, the comeback or climax, actually feels climactic. And you're going to set up throughout the course of those first 2 acts some obstacle, something that must be overcome. And by that, I don't mean like a physical hurdle that is in the ring. I'm not talking about an object. What I'm talking about is a storytelling device. That is the obstacle that must be overcome. And usually in short-form storytelling, and you could think of that as matches that last 10 or 15 or even 20 minutes, there is usually only one obstacle introduced. The antagonist works over the head and neck. The shoulder is separated when it clashes with the ring post, and that introduces an obstacle for the protagonist to have to overcome. The leg of one of the characters is compromised, and then that becomes an obstacle impeding their progress throughout the match. Those are the kinds of obstacles I'm referring to when we break down overcoming the obstacle today. And although there are plenty of approaches to making professional wrestling, and not all of them hinge on traditional 3-act structure, one thing is true, that groundwork, those early parts of the match where we set up whatever the audience must understand, is in furtherance of delivering a climactic finish. In furtherance of this philosophy, let's understand these terms before we go any further. The story of the match, whatever it centers on, like an injured leg, a separated shoulder, a cracked rib, etc. From this point forward, that is the obstacle that we must overcome. I want to be clear that these are guidelines in my opinion. None of them are hard and fast rules. Could you do a short-form match that has more than one story to it? I'm sure that you could. Could you do a long-form match, one that runs 30 or 45 or 60 minutes, that only tells one single story and never deviates from that? I'm sure that could be done as well. So don't think of this as a hard and fast rule. You can play a little loose with this as a guideline. However, in the overwhelming majority of cases, I do think you will find that this is how it is applied. When you are choosing how you want to tell the story of the first 2 acts of your match, consider how you're going to put the obstacle in place. And then, after it is there, how are you going to heighten it? It's not enough to just introduce an obstacle into the story. The second act, the heat, is about rising tension. It's about the stakes becoming bigger. And that means that the obstacle must become more formidable. You will need to heighten it as the second act goes on, or the heat doesn't get any hotter. And once all that groundwork has been done, then you are predisposed for an effective third act, because all that storytelling, the obstacle that you've introduced, that is going to inform every single choice you make when designing the climax of the performance. So now that we've talked about it pretty extensively in theoretical form, how about we put this into practical application? Let's talk about some real examples and how you can deploy them in your matches. Here's one example that I think will be easy to imagine. I've injured my neck. So if I am the character who in the first 2 acts of a match has injured their neck, when the third act comes around, if my signature move is a German suplex, will I be able to land that back bridge directly on top of my head and neck and be able to hold it? No way. So the story that we have told, the obstacle we've put in place during the first 2 acts, is honored and is then informing the choices that we make in the third act. We are choosing not to land that into a perfect back bridge, because if the story of the match is that my neck has been compromised, there is no way I would be able to execute that move and hold the bridge. Here's another practical example of this that I also think is easy to envision. My kneecap has been smashed into the apron of the ring. So if I am the character whose kneecap has been smashed, maybe even repeatedly, into the apron of the ring throughout Acts 1 and 2, but my comeback typically features me bouncing off the ropes 3 times, am I likely to be able to run those ropes, given the obstacle, given the story we have already told? No way. If my leg is all beat up, if my kneecap has been smashed, if I've temporarily dislocated my patella brain, is there any way that I could possibly be running the ropes back and forth at full speed? It's impossible. In order to honor the story of the first 2 acts, I cannot do that in the third. Here's another easy to understand example about overcoming the obstacle. My lower back has been wrecked. So if I am the character that just spent the first 2 acts of a professional wrestling match having my lower back punished and pummeled, but in the 3rd act I must pick up my opponent for a powerbomb so that I can finish them off, am I likely to do that? No way! There's no way I could lift my opponent up if the entirety of our story has been about one thing, affecting my lower back. Because if I pick him up and deliver that powerbomb, I've negated the obstacle. I've not overcome the obstacle, I've negated it. Similarly, in the example where my head and neck have been worked over for the first 2/3 of the story, if I execute my German suplex and land that back bridge right on top of my head and neck, and I'm unaffected by my decision to do this, I have negated the obstacle. I'm not honoring the story that I just spent all that time and all that sweat telling to the audience. I've negated the obstacle instead of overcoming the obstacle. And so what are some ways in which I might be able to overcome the obstacle instead of negating it? Well, in the example of the German suplex, where the first 2 acts of the match have been about wearing down my head and neck, if I were to execute the German suplex and I land on top of my head in that back bridge, I think the head and neck give out immediately, and I have got to acknowledge everything that's been done to my head and neck by selling the pain that I'm in. Even if that means I can't hold on to the bridge and I lose control of my opponent even before the count of 1. Well, what about in the example where my finishing move is the powerbomb, but in the first 2/3 of the story, my lower back has been punished? Well, when the time comes for me to attempt my finisher, my back has to give out. I should not be capable of lifting my opponent. Otherwise, I have just negated the exact story I told. So sticking with the powerbomb example for just a moment then, how might I overcome the obstacle of my lower back having been pummeled throughout the course of the match? Well, if I were to just stand on the mat, load my opponent into powerbomb position, and pick them all the way up to be able to deliver that finishing move, well, I think I've negated the story. But what if that's the only move I can use to finish off my opponent? For whatever reason, I'm stuck with that as the finish that's been asked. How could I still do the powerbomb without negating the obstacle of the match? Well, here's an example. Maybe I would have the opponent load me up onto the top turnbuckle to try a superplex, and as they were climbing up, I would slide right down their back as if to do a sunset flip, but pull them off of the corner into a powerbomb. That way, I don't have to lift them. I don't have to use my lower back to create the move, but instead, I could take advantage of the circumstance of the superplex so that I could still get to my finishing move. That's an example of overcoming the obstacle instead of negating the obstacle. Demonstrating your ability to overcome the obstacle in a story while performing a professional wrestling match distinguishes you as a polished pro. We have a responsibility to tell a complete story when we are between the ropes, and that can be done by honoring whatever obstacle we create and then positioning it such that it must be overcome. It is never negated. When we do this, we're going to find audiences are more appreciative and our matches end up being more memorable because stories that are assembled logically and deployed in a congruous manner are easier to remember than those which are not. If a deeper dive into the structural and performative elements of professional wrestling, like we just did today on Till We Make It, is the sort of work you want to explore, I can't recommend strongly enough my own book, 7 Keys to Becoming a Better Performer, a book for fellow pro wrestlers. You can grab it on Amazon or the audiobook awaits you over at Audible.